The heavy cardstock of the merger portfolio hit the carpet with a dull, heavy slap. Sadie didn't just drop the folders. Her knees gave out, and she followed them down. She ended up crouching beside the brushed steel leg of my office desk, one hand gripping the metal edge just to keep herself upright. Her knuckles were white. The gray daylight from the Chicago skyline poured through the floor-to-ceiling windows, casting long, harsh shadows across the scattered spreadsheets. I stood over her, the fabric of my gray t-shirt pulling tight across my shoulders as I braced my hands on my hips. I didn't reach for her immediately. I just watched her breathe. She was wearing a white-ribbed tank top, the kind you throw on when you haven't slept in 36 hours and professional attire has ceased to matter. Her red hair, usually a structured armor, was falling loose around her shoulders. She stared at the numbers on the floor, her chest rising and falling in shallow, rapid shifts.
"He hit it," she said.
Her voice was barely a rasp over the hum of the climate control. Marcus hid $30 million in liabilities under the shell company. If the board votes tomorrow, I sign the merger, and my father's firm absorbs the debt. We'll be bankrupt in 90 days. She looked up at me. The absolute exhaustion in her posture was a physical weight in the room. I didn't offer a platitude. I didn't tell her it would be fine. I walked to the heavy oak door of my office, grasped the handle, and pushed it shut until the latch clicked into place, sealing us off from the noise of my analysts in the bullpen. "Just stay with me for a minute," I told her, my voice dropping to a low, even register. "Don't look at the paper. Look at the desk." A sudden silence settled over the room, thick and absolute. The panic in her eyes didn't vanish, but the spinning stopped. I knelt down beside her on the carpet, keeping a foot of space between us. I didn't touch her. I reached for the top spreadsheet, my eyes scanning the subsidiary codes Marcus had buried in the fourth quarter projections. The trap was elegant. It was vicious. And it was exactly the kind of mess I was hired to dismantle. "He's using a deferred tax asset shield," I said, my tone clipped and analytical. "It looks like revenue on the surface. It's not." "I missed it," she whispered, twisting the silver ring on her right hand. "I stared at it for 3 weeks, Luca, and I missed it." "You missed it because you're an executive looking at a growth model," I replied, pulling a red pen from my pocket. "I'm a forensic auditor. I look for the lie." I capped the pen and finally looked at her. "He needs a 2/3 majority by 9 a.m. Friday. That gives us 4 days. I stood up, offering her my hand. "Get up, Sadie. We have work to do." She took my hand. Her grip was cold, unsteady. As I pulled her to her feet, I didn't pull her into my chest. I transferred her weight until she was balanced on her own, a grounding point in the middle of a disaster. The transfer of stability was immediate. Her shoulders dropped a fraction of an inch. The threat hadn't changed, but the math had. The rain hit the glass of the high-rise in sharp, aggressive bursts. We were sitting at the long conference table in my firm's war room. It was 11 p.m. on a Tuesday. Sadie was surrounded by banker's boxes. She had brought everything. 7 years of ledgers, vendor contracts, and email hard copies. Marcus wasn't just a rival VP. He was the board's golden boy. He had charm, he had pedigree, and he had an aggressive timeline to push her out before she realized the company she was fighting to save was being hollowed out from the inside. I watched her from the end of the table. She was highlighting a printed email, her brow furrowed in concentration. She had been working for 9 straight hours. The coffee beside her was cold. My phone vibrated on the table. It was my lead investigator. I picked it up. "Talk," I said, keeping my voice low. "Marcus has a hidden clause in the vendor agreements," the voice on the line reported. "Section 4B. It triggers an automatic buyout of the subsidiary debt if the merger is contested publicly. If she goes to the press, the debt becomes immediately payable. He's got her boxed in. I didn't react. I compartmentalized the data. Get me the original incorporation filings for the subsidiary. Look for overlapping board members. I want it by morning. I ended the call and placed the phone face down on the table, sliding it away from me. Sadie looked up. Was that about the vendor contracts? It was. I stood up and walked over to where she was sitting. I didn't explain the clause yet. She didn't need more panic. She needed focus. You need to stop reading. I can't stop. If I find the misallocation proof in these operational expenses, I can stall the vote. She rubbed her eyes, a gesture of sheer exhaustion. Marcus told the board I was mismanaging the supply chain. I have to prove he's lying. You will. I reached out and gently pulled the highlighter out of her hand. She blinked in surprise. But not tonight. Luca, I have a deadline. And I have a rule, I countered, leaning my hip against the edge of the table. My clients don't make strategic decisions on zero sleep. You're operating on adrenaline. You're going to miss a variable. She opened her mouth to argue, her frustration evident in the tight line of her jaw. She was used to carrying the entire weight of her father's company. She was terrified of stopping because stopping meant admitting she was losing. I didn't argue back. I simply closed the file folder in front of her. I've ordered food. It will be here in 10 minutes. You're going to eat something that isn't from a vending machine, and then my driver is taking you home. I don't want to go home, she said quietly. The admission hovered in the air, vulnerable and raw. If I go home, I just stare at the ceiling and run the numbers in my head. I looked at her tired eyes, the fierce resilience in her posture battling against physical burnout. Then you can sleep on the couch in my office. That you are done looking at spreadsheets for the next 8 hours. She let out a shaky exhale, the fight draining out of her. Okay. It was a small victory, but it was a structural one. I couldn't fix the board vote tonight, but I could fix her environment. I could create a timeout zone where she didn't have to be the boss. The next 3 days were a masterclass in forensic reconstruction. My war room became a bunker. The air smelled of old paper and ozone from the heavy-duty printers. The external pressure was a ticking clock, but inside the room, we built a rhythm. I spent Thursday morning mapping the financial architecture of Marcus's shell company. I sat at my terminal, running predictive models through our proprietary audit software. The data was obscured through multiple layers of offshore holding companies, a classic obfuscation tactic. Look at the depreciation schedules, I said, pointing at the monitor as Sadie stood beside my chair. I kept my hands on the keyboard. He's aggressively writing down the assets of the parent company while inflating the subsidiary's value. It's a textbook value extraction. Sadie leaned in to look at the screen. She was close enough that I could smell the faint scent of vanilla and rain on her coat. I didn't turn my head. I focused entirely on the cursor blinking on the screen. The discipline was a necessity. The more I wanted to look at her, the more rigid I became, anchoring my attention to the numbers. So he's intentionally bankrupting us to buy the remaining assets at a fraction of the cost, she murmured, tracing a line of data on the screen with her finger. He needs the merger to finalize the transfer. Exactly. I hit a few keys, isolating the transaction dates. And I have the wire transfer logs that prove he authorized the movements. But it's not enough to just show the board. Marcus will claim they were legitimate operational expenses. Then what do we do? She asked. I leaned back in my chair, looking up at her. We don't argue with him. We audit his primary vendor. I pulled up a new document. I filed a formal request for discovery this morning through my firm's legal proxy, citing a compliance review on your behalf. The vendor panicked. They handed over their internal communications. I handed her a printed stack of emails. Sadie took them, her eyes scanning the text. The realization hit her, visible in the sudden straightening of her spine. This is Marcus instructing them to inflate the invoices, she said, her voice steadying. It's documented fraud. It's leverage, I corrected her gently. and it's yours. She looked at the papers, then looked at me. The trust in her eyes wasn't built on a romantic gesture. It was built on measurable reality. I hadn't offered her empty promises. I had handed her a weapon made of paper and ink. That afternoon, Elena, Sadie's assistant, arrived with a fresh box of files and an anxious expression. "Sadie, Marcus just called an emergency executive meeting for 4 p.m., Elena said, setting the box down heavily. "He knows you're digging. He's pushing for a vote of no confidence today to strip your access before tomorrow's board meeting." The temperature in the room seemed to drop. Sadie's hand drifted to the silver ring on her finger, twisting it sharply. The escalation was brutal. If she lost her executive access, she couldn't present the findings to the full board. "He's using the non-disclosure clause," Sadie said, her voice tight. "If I bring these emails into that meeting, he'll claim I violated company policy by using an outside auditor without board approval. He'll terminate me for cause." She started pacing, the panic returning. "I have to go in there and defend my operational record without using the proof. It's a trap." I watched her pace. I didn't tell her to calm down. I didn't offer a hug. I picked up my jacket from the back of the chair. "You aren't going into that meeting alone," I said, sliding my arms into the sleeves. She stopped. "Luca, you aren't an employee. You can't be in the executive briefing." "I'm not going as an employee." I picked up my briefcase, snapping the locks shut with a sharp metallic sound. "I'm going as your retained fiduciary counsel. Under Section 8 of your corporate bylaws, an executive under formal review has the right to financial representation." I walked toward the door and held it open for her. "He wants to play rules? We'll play rules." The executive boardroom was a sterile expanse of glass and polished mahogany. Marcus sat at the head of the table, looking entirely too comfortable in his tailored suit. 3 other senior VPs flanked him, looking nervous. When Sadie and I walked in, the conversation stopped. Marcus frowned, his eyes darting to me. "Sadie, this is an internal meeting. Outsiders aren't permitted." Sadie didn't hesitate. She walked to the center of the table and placed her folder down. "This is Luca Hansen, my retained fiduciary counsel. As you are calling for a review of my financial management, my representation is legally mandated." Marcus's jaw tightened, but he couldn't argue the bylaw. He gestured to a chair. "Fine, but the counsel observes he doesn't speak." "I don't need to speak," I said mildly, taking a seat against the wall, leaving the table to Sadie. I kept my posture relaxed, unthreatening, but my eyes never left Marcus. Marcus launched into his presentation. He had charts, he had projections. He systematically dismantled Sadie's departmental performance, painting her as incompetent and overwhelmed. It was a calculated, public humiliation. I watched Sadie. She sat perfectly still, absorbing the blows. She didn't interrupt. She didn't get defensive. When Marcus finally finished, he looked at her with a patronizing smile. "The numbers don't lie, Sadie. It's time to step down." Sadie opened her folder. She didn't pull out the fraud evidence. She pulled out a single sheet of paper. "You're right, Marcus. The numbers don't lie," she said, her voice clear and carrying across the quiet room. "Which is why I find your operational expenditure report fascinating. You've cited a 15% increase in logistics costs under my department." She slid the paper across the table. "This is the signed authorization for those logistics costs. It bears your signature, overriding my department's vendor choice in favor of a supplier that charges a premium." The room went dead silent. The other VPs leaned in to look at the paper. Marcus's face flushed. That was a strategic supply chain decision to ensure quality. "It was an override that inflated the budget you are now using to declare me incompetent," Sadie interrupted smoothly. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. "I am submitting this to the HR record to officially contest your review. There will be no vote of no confidence today. We will present our respective cases to the full board tomorrow." She stood up, closing her folder. She didn't look back as she walked toward the door. I stood up and followed her out, leaving Marcus staring at the paper in silence. As the heavy glass doors closed behind us in the hallway, Sadie let out a long, shaky breath. The adrenaline crash was immediate. I stopped walking. "You handled that perfectly." She looked at me, her eyes wide. "He's going to accelerate the timeline. He knows I'm on to the vendor. He'll push the board vote to 8 a.m. tomorrow." "Let him." I checked my watch. "We have the wire logs. We have his emails. Tomorrow, we dismantle him." At 2 a.m., the war room was quiet. The final audit binders were assembled, perfectly indexed and stacked on the table. The hard work was done. The wait was the hardest part. Sadie was sitting on the leather sofa in the corner of my office, a blanket draped over her knees. She was staring out at the city lights, the tension radiating from her in waves. I poured a glass of water and walked over, handing it to her. "Thank you," she murmured, taking the glass. Our fingers brushed briefly against the cool glass. It was a functional touch, but it acted as a grounding wire. The subtle tremor in her hands stopped. I sat down on the opposite end of the sofa, maintaining a deliberate distance. The silence in the room wasn't empty. It was a shelter against the storm waiting for us in the morning.
"I didn't think I would survive this week," she said quietly, her gaze fixed on the water glass. "When I saw those numbers on Monday, I thought my father's legacy was gone." "It was never gone," I replied, keeping my voice low. "It was just buried." She looked at me, a genuine vulnerability in her expression. "Why did you stay, Luca? Your firm usually handles the audit and hands off the results to the lawyers. You didn't have to sit in that boardroom with me today." I looked at the careful indexing of the binders on the desk. The truth was, my profession was built on observing disasters from a safe distance. I charted ruins. I didn't usually stand in the burning building. "I don't like bullies who use spreadsheets as weapons," I said honestly, focusing on the practical truth. "And I don't like watching someone competent be told they're failing." She didn't push for a more romantic answer. She understood the language of action. She set the glass down and rested her head back against the leather. "I'm terrified about tomorrow," she admitted. I didn't offer a hollow reassurance. I didn't reach across the distance to pull her close. Instead, I made a concrete promise. "I will be sitting right behind you," I said. "When he speaks, you look at your notes. When you speak, you present the facts. The math is on our side. It doesn't require bravery, Sadie. It just requires accuracy." She closed her eyes, and for the first time in days, her breathing fell into a slow, steady rhythm. The quiet room held us both, a temporary sanctuary before the final battle. The executive boardroom was packed at 8 a.m. The full board of directors sat around the massive table. Mr. Vance, the board chairman, looked impatient. Marcus was already at the podium presenting the merger as a life-saving necessity. He was polished, persuasive, and completely full of lies. I sat in the gallery row, directly behind Sadie's chair. I had a locked briefcase on my lap. "The operational bleed in the supply chain is unsustainable," Marcus concluded, clicking to a final disastrous graph. "If we do not vote to approve this merger and transfer the subsidiary debt, we will face insolvency. I motion for an immediate vote." Mr. Vance nodded slowly. "Thank you, Marcus. Are there any objections before we proceed?" Sadie stood up. She didn't look at me. She didn't look nervous. She looked like a woman who had finally read the correct map. "I object," Sadie said clearly. "I object to the merger, and I object to the fraudulent data presented in this room." A murmur went through the board. Marcus gripped the edge of the podium. "Sadie, this is desperate." "It's accurate," she corrected, walking to the table and placing a thick binder in front of Mr. Vance. She gestured to me. I stood up, opening my briefcase and passing copies to the rest of the board members. "What you are looking at Sadie continued, her voice ringing with absolute authority, is a forensic audit of the subsidiary company. It details $30 million in liabilities intentionally shifted from the parent company via inflated vendor invoices. Marcus stepped forward. This is unauthorized outside interference. She has violated protocol. Turn to page 42, Sadie instructed the board, ignoring him completely. You will find internal emails from Marcus authorizing the inflation, followed by wire transfer logs moving the excess capital into a holding company. A company, as the incorporation documents on page 50 show, that Marcus privately owns. The silence in the room was absolute, heavy, and final. The sound of pages turning was the only noise. Mr. Vance looked up from the binder, his face grim. He looked at Marcus. Is this true? Marcus opened his mouth, then closed it. The proof was measurable reality. There was no spin left. The motion to vote on the merger is canceled, Mr. Vance stated, slamming his folder shut. Marcus, you are suspended pending a full legal review. Sadie, we will need your team to present a recovery plan by Monday. Sadie nodded. It's already drafted. She turned and looked at me. The external threat was gone, dismantled by process and truth. An hour later, we were standing in the lobby of the building. The morning rush was in full swing, people moving past us in a blur of coffee and briefcases. Sadie was holding her copy of the audit binder. The exhaustion was still there, but the crushing weight had been lifted. They're calling the authorities, she said, looking out the glass doors at the street. Marcus is being escorted out. The system works when you force it to, I noted, checking my phone for messages from my office. I looked up to find her watching me. The dynamic had shifted. She was no longer a client in crisis. She was the executive who had just saved her company, and I was the external auditor whose job was technically done. Your firm's invoice is going to be massive, she noted, a small, genuine smile finally breaking through. I'll make sure they itemize the late-night coffee, I replied smoothly. We stood there for a moment. The logical next step was to shake hands and walk away. That was my pattern. Fix the problem, close the file, exit. But as I looked at her, I felt a sudden, sharp reluctance to leave the quiet room we had built together over the last week. The chaotic noise of the lobby felt entirely disconnected from the stillness I found when I stood next to her. Sadie shifted her binder to one hand. She didn't offer a handshake. She took a step closer, closing the safe distance I had meticulously maintained. You didn't just audit the accounts, Luca, she said softly, her eyes holding mine. You made me stop spinning. You made me sit down and eat. You made me feel secure when everything else was falling apart. She reached out and rested her hand flat against the center of my chest. It wasn't a tentative touch. It was a claim. The contact acted like a physical shield against the noise of the lobby. The world outside her hand faded into irrelevance. I looked down at her hand, then up at her face. The fierce resilience was still there, but the fear was gone. I didn't step back. I brought my hand up and covered hers, pressing it firmly against my chest. It was a grounding connection, a transfer of stability that flowed both ways. I don't walk away from a solid investment, I said, my voice barely above a whisper, stripping away the professional detachment. And I don't want to walk away from you. Her smile widened, reaching her eyes. She tilted her head up. I leaned down and kissed her. It was exactly one kiss. There was no desperate hunger, no frantic exploration. It was an absolute destination. It felt like dropping a heavy anchor in a safe harbor, a seal on a promise that we had built through long hours and hard truths. It was the feeling of finality, of arriving at a place where the fighting stopped. When I pulled back, she kept her hand on my chest. What happens now? She asked. Now, I said, adjusting the collar of her coat with practical care, I go back to my office and write your invoice. And then, at 7 p.m., I am taking you to dinner, and we aren't going to talk about spreadsheets. She let out a soft laugh. It's a deal. She turned and walked toward the elevators, her posture straight, her authority restored. I watched her go, a profound sense of peace settling over me. The void of the superficial corporate battles was gone, replaced by the solid, unshakable reality of a true partnership. Looking back, the numbers were the easy part. The real challenge wasn't finding the hidden debt. It was learning that true victory isn't fought alone. I learned that winning the wrong way is actually losing, and true victory is sleeping with a clear conscience next to someone you trust implicitly. Healthy love isn't found in dramatic rescues or chaotic passion. It's found in the quiet consistency of someone who shows up, tells the truth, and makes the world feel a little more secure. Please like and subscribe so we can share more stories like this.